behind in their payments by at least 90 days. Data due to be released by the central bank this week is expected to show that more than 80,000 households are now in arrears.
Joining us this morning to discuss these figures is Carl Dieter from Irish Mortgage Brokers and Nolene Blackwell from the Free Legal Advice Centre. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Carl, I'm going to come to you first. I mean, we see on the front of the Mail this morning it's saying 1 in 10 3 months behind on their mortgage, and the banks are saying we're overwhelmed, oh woe is us, we can't cope. And from my perspective, I'm thinking, surely you knew this day was come to pass. They haven't tried to prevent this situation occurring. They've just been sticking to their guns and not meeting people halfway.
Well, I suppose when you have an economic meltdown like we've had, that's not something that you can control from a business perspective. So the banks don't really have an ability to stop this from occurring. It's really their response is a thing that they can manage, and that is the portion which I think they've done a terrible job on.
There's been no response. It's been business as usual.
Well, it hasn't been business as usual because credit is contracting rapidly. We saw the Irish Bankers Federation figures come out to show that mortgage lending is down yet again. So what they're doing is effectively they're taking out all of their staff from productive aspects of banking and turning them all into collectors. In terms of the way that this is going and why these figures are seen as holding credibility is because every quarter we see a ratcheting up of the arrears by about 12 to 13%. And so you can actually predict what the arrears will be in 2 quarters' time because it has this totally consistent movement throughout every year that we've been keeping track of them. We started off the year, there was about 46,000 cases in arrears. The present read on it is about 72,000. It's expected to be 80,000 when figures are released this week. The fascinating thing I find, though, is that in arrears in different countries, you quite often have this thing called self-cure, where people dip into arrears, they come back out. Because not all arrears is driven by unemployment. Sometimes it's about having an expenditure shock, where you suddenly get a big bill to fix your car, for instance, that you need in order to get to work, and you have to spend money on that. What we're seeing, though, in Ireland is that the self-cure is not happening, and in fact the people that are more than 180 days in arrears, which is about 6 months, went from 35,000 up to 53,000. That's a really concerning thing. So what happens is when people are going down, they're not just getting slightly damaged, they're getting knocked out, they're staying down.
Carl, there was some controversy about it in an article that you did in the recent past about what you called was strategic defaulting. Yeah. Now, I don't doubt for 1 second that there's some cute whores out there who would do it if they could get away with it. I just don't understand how it would work. I'm just thinking of my own personal situation. For me to stop my mortgage, which is on a direct debit, I would have to go to the bank, who I borrowed the money off in the first place. I would have to stop that standing order that month. And there is no way in hell they would allow me get away with it. And I would imagine that's pretty much the same for everybody.
Just don't have the money in the account, though. If it's not there, they can't take it out.
Well, there's a few ways that it happens. For a start, a lot of people didn't borrow money from the people that they have their current account with. And so you can stop your standing order, and it doesn't have that effect. In terms of why it happens, how it happens...
Very hard to stop a standing order for your mortgage without red flags going off all over the place.
It's actually not. If you want to stop any standing order, you can do it in the morning. You cancel the direct debit, you just simply sign a letter, send it into the bank, and it's done. In terms of the repercussions on it, the bank are not actually equipped to deal with the size of the problem that they have, and they'll actually be quite candid about that. Banks are there to deal with paper assets and financial transactions. When you get into high customer-facing interactions, such as what collectors are doing, they're quite inefficient. And so, although we have this process there, and although we have various resolution schemes and regulation there to control this, the fact is that in many cases the banks are totally snowed under. Some collectors are only calling people who haven't been contacted by a human being in a year. Quite often, the first response of a bank is if you miss a payment, you'll go straight to interest only. It's like, just see if that fixes the problem because we're busy dealing with the real deeper set of arrears. Unfortunately, the way that we would like the world to work is not the way that it actually works.
Can I say,
and although we spent that money on the banks, we're not getting the value for it.
They're not reporting what you're saying the banks are doing. They aren't reporting that the banks are meeting and maybe even not even phoning them. They're reporting huge pressure being put on them, and even sometimes an unpleasant aspect to the discussion. Well, you know, people feeling bullied and pressured.
Nolene, you're getting that, obviously.
Yeah, that's right. We and I have had a semi-public row with Carl about the strategic default business, because what we find is that people are desperately anxious to keep their mortgage going. People really want to pay to keep that particular debt going, and we're finding people who are leaving themselves with literally short in order to keep up repayment of that and other debts. And that very point is coming across as well, that people are being hassled. But I think that's part of the problem. It is true that the banks are dealing with it on a case-by-case basis. So Carl is clearly reporting what he is hearing, and you're reporting what you're hearing, and we're all reporting in this chaos that is the lack of any decent system to track what is going to happen when you announce that you're at risk of going into arrears or that you're in arrears. And this is the real problem. And it was good to see that the central bank was saying, look to the banks, you actually have to recognise and realise the extent of your mortgage debt losses, because it's a huge burden on everyone. Now,
Noreen, can I ask you a question here? Is there not a huge amount of disingenuousness going on? Actually, let's not sugarcoat it. There's an enormous amount of lying and hypocrisy that's going on here. We've got Honohan turning around and saying, and I quote, that the banks need to analyse their mortgage books a little bit. Carry out detailed analysis of their mortgage books to find out which borrowers should voluntarily surrender properties, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
Carl has just indicated there how they can actually track exactly, month by month, quarter by quarter, what those mortgage books are deteriorating or falling apart at. So that's a lie. They know that information already. We also know that, Matthew Elderfield came out and said this, and we had a discussion about it before we came on. The banks have struggled to cope because they were only geared to sell mortgages.
Yeah.
And what was it you said to me about Elizabeth Warren in the States saying?
Well, she made the analogy, you're not allowed to sell a toaster that will explode, so why should you be allowed to sell a financial product that explodes as well? And the truth was that people selling exploding mortgages were not regulated until 2007, when the bust was actually starting at that stage.
And now they're being allowed to abdicate their responsibility.
And the thing is that it is known, the level of their responsibility is known, and everybody knows that they have to deal with it, but they're allowed being get away with the later rather than sooner argument. It's not fair. It is 4 years into a situation where we've known that the banks had to recognise they were going to have to write down some mortgage debt, they were going to have to reschedule other mortgage debt, and other people were going to pay for it. And there is a cost to all society of doing that, but there has been a lack of ingenuousness, if that's the opposite, a lack of honesty about that. That is very frustrating for tens of thousands of people.
I'm just going to bring Carl to finish, because I can see he wants to make a point.
I would just say that not to become an apologist for banks, but they actually know the number of unsustainable mortgages they have because it was a requirement they
so why did
report them.
say that?
I don't know. You'd have to ask them.
Okay, one final question. Just one final question, because people at home will be saying, hang on a second here. We recapitalised these banks. Yeah. We gave them all this money. We bailed them out.
We own them.
So that they could deal with this problem. They have got the money. Now, they seem to want to hang on to that, and they still want us to pay the debts that we can't afford to pay. So how is that supposed to work?
Well, forbearance to individuals means that you don't enforce the contract straight away, and the banks are exercising that forbearance by not repossessing properties, and they're looking for that in return, that they're not forced to look to acknowledge their losses straight away, because the longer that banks have to resolve an issue, the greater their odds are of finding a way out of it. And that is absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. They hope. Having said that,
if you say way that they hoped it wouldn't crack.
Yes, that's right.
Plan, though, Carl?
If you were to push it all through and force their hand instantly right now, you'd be doing it into a market where there's not credit for the new buyers to take on the properties, where you'd turn banks into property management companies and collection companies, which is far distant from what they're actually meant to be doing.
And that's in the interest of the banks, but the interest of the consumer is not well served by this.
Noreen and Carl, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm afraid we could continue. Many thanks to you both.
Cheers.